The 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted African Americans the right to vote in 1870. But it wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement, nearly 100 years later, that many blacks were able to exercise that right. Until then, in parts of the U.S. South, African Americans were often bullied and harassed at the polls and effectively prevented from voting.
His truth is marching.
But in 1964, civil rights groups worked to change that. They organized protest marches in the southern state of Alabama, which resulted in violence by whites against many of the marchers. That led President Johnson to eventually sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965, removing the final barricades that prevented blacks and other minorities from voting.
Well, we were very excited because we had the right to vote at that time, and the majority of the people I know of registered and voted.
But Layla's worried those protections could soon be undone. That's because the U.S. Supreme Court is considering whether to revoke a section of the Voting Rights Act, which gives federal officials oversight over some state and local elections. Washington currently oversees 9 states with histories of racial discrimination from Alabama to Alaska. It also covers parts of states from California to New Hampshire. It's been a potent tool for defeating racism at the polls, protecting not just blacks, but all racial minorities in the United States. But now Shelby County is challenging the Voting Rights Act before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that Alabama has come a long way since the 1960s when minority voters were treated differently. And the state's voting practices no longer require federal oversight. Attorney Butch Ellis says Shelby County's case isn't against all sections of the Voting Rights Act, just the part that requires jurisdictions to get federal pre-clearance before making changes to how elections are conducted. He says the law should be applied evenly or not at all.
If you are imposing less sovereignty on some states than others, that you're putting current burdens on these governments, you've got to have a current justification for it. Current justification, not a justification from 1964.
But Layla's not so sure things have changed.
We're not equal like we should be, but we should be equal and have every right that any citizens of the county, Shelby County, or either Alabama have.
Which is why she and so many others in the American South are hopeful that the Supreme Court keeps all of the U.S. Voting Rights Act intact. Kimberly, Halkett, Al Jazeera, Shelby County, Alabama.